The break. I hope all of the exchanges that you had were very fruitful. So we'd like to begin this panel on digital transformation. And as a matter of introduction, just like to say myself that any future fit public servant needs to know what's going on in the world of digital transformation. Even folks like me, a public servant who likes to kind of have a wait-and-see attitude on technology, has found it very helpful and beneficial to follow this file fairly closely. So I think you're going to really enjoy this panel today. I think it's going to be very interesting with the focus on some exchange between panel members as well. So slightly different than some of the other panels. So my role, I'm going to introduce the moderator, Jacky, and then Jacky is going to introduce the rest of the panel at appropriate time, and then we'll go from there. So Jacky is a principal at the Delta Vega Consulting, and she's also in academia, currently a PhD student at the Carleton Public Policy and Public Administration. She's also a former federal public service director, having worked for Treasury Board Secretariat in large line departments as well as small agencies. Her files were primarily on transformation, which is great for this session. Things like expenditure review, implementing new legislative or policy requirements, or on service delivery renewal. Her research areas of focus centers on senior management decision-making behavior for digital transformation, and current projects include digital transformation research, strategic as well as program review, as well as delivering executive coaching. So with that, Jacky, over to you.
Merci. Good morning, everybody. Soyez le bienvenu. I hope the snacks were good. Before we get started, can you all hear me clearly? Head nods, great. Has anybody in this room renewed their Ontario driver's license recently? Did you use an app for that? Head nods. How many of us in this room availed ourselves of an app to set up some COVID vax bookings? Interesting. Excellent. So I'll come back to that question in a moment. But a future fit public sector designs and delivers programs and services for people in Canada that are simple, secure, easy to use, and that meets people's needs wherever they are. So that COVID Vax app, you might have done that while you were in the car because it's a red light and all the bridges are blocked. Or you might, or you might, as my husband did, actually renew his driver's license while he was in line at the service center, and that lineup was going to go on for at least an hour or so. Okay, so that is the digital transformation here that I want to talk about, and that our panelists are going to bring their wisdom to bear on. It's the redesign of program service delivery. Program service delivery. It's not IT. It's program service redesign. And always with the goal to better serve peoples. I'm going to make my comments brief so that we can hear from these folks about digital transformation, and importantly, how we then get to a digital government, right? So some quick housekeeping notes. I'll quickly introduce the speakers, who are then going to provide some comments, their insights onto these files, followed by a short question from me, just like that little give and take part. Then it's going to be followed by an open conversation amongst them with some interventions, helpful contributions, right, from us. And then we're going to turn to the room. So our real focus here is to sort of front load so that there's a lot of time for Q&A from the floor. So get your questions ready. We want this to be a dialogue. So without further ado, the panelists. So please welcome Yves Giroux, the Parliamentary Budget Officer for the Government of Canada, Ryan Anderson, no, don't turn your voice away from the mic. Ryan Androsoff, CEO and founder of Think Digital, as well as Dacanay, the Director General for Digital Policy at Treasury Board Secretariat. So Yves Giroux was appointed to serve as the Parliamentary Budget Officer in 2018. He's an economist by training, and he's been closely involved in federal budgeting processes in a variety of capacities and is an expert in those matters, as well as the government's expenditure management system. I know many of you are very familiar with that system as well. On September 15th this year, his office published a report titled Overview of the Government's Digital Service Transformation, which made pertinent, maybe even pointed observations about monitoring and reporting of data and information on the digital file, and we are eagerly awaiting his comments on that report today. Ryan Androsoff, a former public servant, federal as well, is the founder and CEO of Think Digital, as I'd mentioned, and it's a consultancy that focuses on building the next-gen leadership for digital public service delivery. He's an international expert on the file with decades of experience, and you can tune into his Let's Think Digital podcast if you want to learn more about how technology is transforming government. He co-founded the Canadian Digital Service, which I hope everybody in this room knows about and goes to their blog regularly to check on. This was a startup organization within the federal government. I believe it was always at Treasury. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That launched in 2017 with the mission of helping government design and deliver better digital services. And we also have with us today another digital government founder, and this is Dacanay. She is currently Director General, Digital Policy with Federal Treasury Board Secretariat. She's also co-teaching at McMaster University on the topic of digital transformation in the public sector. There's a theme here, folks. There are a couple of themes, actually. In addition to co-founding the Ontario Digital Services, she's led numerous other public sector renewal and reform initiatives in the governments of Ontario. I'm just going to list a few here, but the takeaway is digital transformation is far more than just IT. So she, as well as others up here, has experience on agile governance, digital capability development, and legislative and policy framework development for digital government. Oops, sorry about that. So here we have policy wonk, economist, policy wonk. There's not an IT specialist at this table. So that's your first key takeaway, or maybe the second, about digital transformation. But enough from me. I'm going to turn shortly to Yves. Just a quick note. When we do get to the Q&A, posez les questions dans la langue de votre choix, English or French. I think we can handle those. Anything else? Okay. Mais maintenant, c'est à vous, Monsieur Giroux.
Merci. So questions in English or French. I'll try to work up on my French a bit. So be nice to me if you ask questions in French. So I've been asked to talk about the perspective from Canadians and parliamentarians when we talk about the issue of digital transformation. So that's based on numerous discussions I have with parliamentarians, MPs and senators when I appear at committee, but also off the record when they ask questions about how does the government work. You may be surprised to hear that parliamentarians come from all walks of life, and relatively few of them know really how governments work. So what they are talking about is what their constituents are saying, necessarily not always flattering about governments. They very often seem surprised when they're first appointed that we as the governments, or you as the government or public servants, ask the same questions over and over again. For example, when you renew your passport, you're asked when and where were you born, and people, like layperson who don't work in government, say, well, I told you that 5 or 10 years ago, and I still was born on the same day in the same place. Why the hell do you keep asking me the same question? Or I told ESDC my date of birth. Why does Passport Canada need to have the same information? I gave you, as the government, that information, or you have all this. I told CRA last month that my income was that. Why does somebody else, provincial, federal, why do you need to ask me again? Don't you talk to each other? So they see government as one big blob, not different departments. They expect the tell us once approach, so they don't understand why they need to repeat the same information. They also expect convenience, and that's the same for parliamentarians. So they expect convenience, but they also expect security. They are apoplectic when something goes amiss, or when there is an information or data leak, but they don't think about that when they want the convenience. So for example, they say, I can do my banking on my smartphone. Why can't I renew a passport or apply for EI on my smartphone? Well, we take security seriously. Well, do you mean my bank doesn't take security very seriously if I can do my banking on my phone? So there's a big disconnect. They don't understand why we are different than the private sector. I can book a flight to the other end of the world on my phone, but I can't see the status of my passport application here. Okay, that's weird. So parliamentarians talk to their constituents, or rather get talked to by their constituents, and that's exactly the concerns they have. They see that things in government move slowly, way too slowly. And again, they can book a flight from Calgary to Ottawa like in a minute, but they can't get answers to what they think are straight questions, very simple questions. So they don't understand why big corporations that have means, big means, but also are driven by the imperative of profit, why these big corporations, Air Canada, Uber, for example, can develop apps pretty quickly, but when the government of Canada tries to do the same, ArriveCan is an example, it costs $54 million. They immediately suspect wrongdoing, and that somebody filled their pockets with money. So all that to say, they also see that the number of public servants has not gone down. It has gone up significantly, but the level of service has gone down because, according to them, because that's what they see. They don't get congratulatory emails or messages. They get complaints in their constituency offices. So they see a disconnect. More public servants in Ottawa, but also more complaints about services in my riding. My constituency office is flooded with calls about immigrant applications, about passport, EI, old age security, and all the other services, less visibility. So they get the complaints, they see the number of public servants going up, so something doesn't jive. And they have the power to hold the government to account, which most of them try to do in good faith. And when public servants appear at committees, they give answers that toe the government's line, toe the party line, and they have a feeling that public servants are working for the government of the day, that they're not giving honest, simple, and clear answers. So it's maybe some of you, maybe some of your supervisors, some of your ministers appearing at committees, House or Senate, and are giving partisan answers, sometimes not giving fulsome answers to avoid embarrassing the government, and they feel that public servants are hiding something. So that's the perspective in which I have to sometimes brief parliamentarians, tell them how government really does work, that you're not there to line up your own pockets, that very rarely will there be wrongdoing. Most of the time people are stuck in a process that is cumbersome, but that also has been, no, my time is up already, that has been put in place to avoid wrongdoing, but it's also making the process much, much more cumbersome than what Uber or Air Canada is facing, or any big bank. Sorry, time is up.
C'est la vie, c'est les choses qui arrivent. This is what happens when you're busy making other plans. So if I may ask a question that would be of interest to this room, for those that hadn't had a chance to read the report yet, you made the observation, well, I Control-F'd it, so you made the observation 4 times in the report that there was no centralized information on the total amounts spent or saved for digital transformation to support providing a government-wide perspective on digital transformation. Could you comment on that finding in the report, please?
Sure. So that was a report drafted at the request of a senator who asked initially how much would it cost to digitize the entire Government of Canada operation. So when I got that request, I really scratched my head and I said, how on earth are we going to do that? So we decided to take a very a narrower approach. We looked at what was already done in what we thought were very good examples, CRA, ESDC, and the move to digital application for passport at IRCC. And in the course of doing that report, we found that there's very limited information as to the distinction between what departments or the government spends for IT, like the basic IT, versus moving towards digitization. So it's all lumped together, IT, and that's it. And there's virtually no data on potential savings because most government departments say it's not savings that we're after, it's service improvements. So it's worrisome from one perspective because what we've heard is that there could very well be savings. We all know it's much cheaper to have citizen interacting on an app or online than calling government departments, or even worse, showing up in person, because that costs a lot. So we all know there is a savings there. It could be offset by increased service levels, but I think it would be very helpful for government departments to try at least to distinguish between the IT, like maintaining, keeping the shop running, versus how much you collectively or we collectively are spending on digitization, and trying to at least have an order of magnitude of the savings this could lead to. And in that respect, IRCC was very helpful in quantifying the savings from an e-passport application. Of course, we'd expect humans to still be heavily involved in issuing passports, thank God, but that's the kind of data that would be very helpful for parliamentarians and citizens to know about.
Merci beaucoup. So there's a couple of takeaways there that I would leave with you. As you go back to your day jobs, planning, performance measurement, results delivery, when you're engaging with folks that are doing digital transformation, there's a challenge, nay, there is an opportunity here to figure out how initiatives are costed and how you're tracking expenditures against the activities intending to deliver results. Work with your partners within your departments to figure out what's gonna get costed to IT straight, hardware, software, guts of stuff, versus digitization, making processes automatic, and then the ever-loving professional services category where you're bringing in the business analysts and the service designers to do the service process re-engineering. That's going to help address some of the questions that were raised through the report. So let me turn now to Ryan, and just for your own reference, they decided on the speaking order beforehand. So I'm going to turn now to Ryan for his comments on this particular file.
Great. Thanks so much, Jacky, and good morning, everybody. Great to be with you here today. I want to talk about a couple of things to kind of lead this off and get us into discussion. And I think the first one, which is an important foundational piece, is what do we mean by digital transformation or digital government? Digital gets thrown around a lot. It certainly is a bit of a buzzword. From my perspective, and I think generally when we are talking about digital transformation in the context of the public sector, it's important to recognize that, yes, technology is driving it, but it's not just about technology. It is about a broader change that is enabled by technology to the way that government works as an organization, when we think about the culture and the processes and the practices of how our organizations work. And that gets codified in a whole variety of different types of ways. And this is an important shift because I think, historically, IT was viewed very much as a back office function. It was the domain of the CIO. It was viewed as this thing that has to get done, kind of a necessary evil to let government be able to do its work. And I would argue, and perhaps maybe somewhat radically, that we're actually seeing a little bit of an awareness now that IT or digital, whatever you want to call it, isn't just this enabler function, but it actually is what government does in 2023. I would go so far as to make this argument that government essentially is an IT company or an IT organization at its core, because technology has infused everything government does. There is nothing that public services do today that don't have technology as some foundation to it. And I think because that mindset hasn't, frankly, caught up widely around digital transcending from just being that back office function to something more front and center, we've had some of these continued problems. Yves was talking about the PBO report that came out last month. Probably many of you may have seen or be aware, just last week, the Auditor General came out with a series of reports, one looking at aging IT and the other looking specifically at benefits delivery modernization at Service Canada and ESDC. And, it highlighted challenges that have been there for over 2 decades. These aren't new challenges, but I would argue that the root of some of them is that there is still this kind of pervasive notion that, policy is the real work. And all this IT stuff is just something we do so we can kind of get to the real work, versus kind of flipping it on its head to recognize that there actually is kind of this elevated importance behind thinking about how we change how we work in this modern digital era. So if we take that as kind of a backdrop to this, I think it kind of leads us to say, what is the theory of change that's going to be able to actually get us there? Because it is asking us to kind of see change happen in organizations. Jacky had mentioned in her introduction, I was involved in setting up the Canadian Digital Service at a Treasury Board Secretariat. One example of an approach that's been taken to set up special purpose teams that can bring in kind of new approaches and new talent into government to be able to tackle some of these challenges differently. This has been done at the provincial level in a variety of jurisdictions. Internationally, we've seen for over decades people trying to kind of take these approaches. There has been attempts to have new policies in place from kind of a leadership and direction setting perspective from Treasury Board and elsewhere. But the reality is it hasn't been enough in and of itself. And I think that's just kind of the honest assessment that we've seen over the last decade or two. I think in the précis for today's session, one of the things that noted was the United Nations does a biannual ranking of digital government around the world, how countries are doing in kind of adapting to digital change. Interestingly enough, if you go back 20 years and kind of the early days of e-government, when governments were first making the shift online, Canada was widely seen as a world leader. We were generally in the top 3 around the world. In the UN ranking, I think we actually peaked in 2010 as 3rd in the world in their ranking system. This most recent one, we were 32nd. And so it's been a noticeable slide. And it's not that we've gotten worse, right? It's not that I think objectively, our digital capacity is worse than it was 10 or 15 years ago. It's that other countries have gotten better faster. And so I do think, and I'll be interested to hear what my other panelists have to say about this, but I think for those of us who are in this space, there is this recognition that what we have been doing is not enough and we need to be able to do more. And so I would argue that actually this community here that is focusing on evaluation, focusing on being able to look at performance is a key part of this puzzle. And that kind of brings me to the last piece that I want to say, which is, when we kind of think about that theory of change and what it means, for me, part of that is thinking about how our organizations work at a deeper level. And I have this mental model that I like to call the Pac-Man model, and essentially goes like this. There's the old management consultant adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think that is 100% true. You can have the greatest digital strategy for your organization, but if you don't have a culture that accepts the way of working, not going to get you very far. But my argument is that there's 2 bigger fish in the sea, sorry to mix the metaphors, and I think that incentives eat culture, and structures eat everything else. And so what I mean by that is, incentives are those things that really dictate how individual employees respond to, things that are going to either help them in their career or push them back in their career. It's the things that are in their performance agreements, right? It's those kind of soft rules in the organization that shift it. And then structures really are how decisions are made. It's the governance question. And I would argue that up until now, when it comes to digital, we've done a lot of work on strategy, we've talked about culture, but there's been very little to actually change the incentives and structures of our organizations. And I think that evaluation, performance measurement, thinking about how to measure the maturity of an organization is one of the key levers to get us there. So really excited that you're talking about this topic here, and hopefully this gives some helpful food for thought as we launch into the discussion. So Jacky, I'll leave it there, and thank you.
I do have a quick follow-up. So you've run some workshops with public sector employees from various levels of government with the Pac-Man model, so getting people to talk about the blockers within their organizations. Would you share some of those observations with the room?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think this will come as a surprise. We've done lots of workshops on this. We also run a digital executive leadership program with the Institute on Governance, which is a nonprofit here in Ottawa, and have been doing it for 5 years now. And so I've had hundreds of executives come through, who've also kind of shared their insights on this. And it is perhaps an unsurprising list. I would say things that are at the top of that list, HR. Right, the way that our HR system is structured, both in terms of recruitment, but then importantly retention and career paths, has not generally caught up to the digital age. Lots of persistent issues that come up there. The governance, approvals, gating processes comes up time and time again. Simply the number and level of approvals to be able to do anything seems to not be well kind of fit to purpose, and there hasn't been a lot of kind of thoughtfulness about how to scale that appropriately in a lot of organizations. And then one of the big ones is budgeting, right, is kind of how the money is set, right? And I think, for those who are familiar with this notion of kind of agile project delivery versus waterfall, our budgeting and financing systems in government tend to be very waterfall, right? The notion is that you're going to be able to have a 5 or 10 year plan up front before you go for funding, and then you simply implement it. And we just know the reality is that you've got to be able to iterate and learn as you go. And a lot of our funding mechanisms internally aren't lined up for that. And then the last one I'll add, which I think is kind of a macro one, is how we think about risk. That I think right now, number one, there's obviously the risk adverseness that we talk about often in government. But I also think, particularly when we talk about digital, the status quo risk often isn't talked about or thought about as enough. This notion that the status quo is actually quite risky. That we know that we're failing when it comes to big transformation projects. And so often the price of inaction is not thought about in some of those management decisions as much as it should be. So those would be some of the big ones, Jacky, that tend to come up.
Thank you very much for that. So, if you're keeping a running list like I am, we have the disconnect from the public experience when they engage with government. We have sort of undercooked expenditure management systems. We have old school notions about what IT is, what digital transformation is, and what the sort of full cost accounting of that is. We have the funding issue, which is, oh gosh, that's a whole conference on its own. Risk smart versus risk averse, governance. I know that Honey also has some thoughts around governance. So hopefully the realization that this is not about IT is permeating the room. Oh, and you had my heart at the whole theory of change thing. I am formerly, an evaluator and risk manager and a performance results delivery person, and I moved to the digital transformation file, and it always broke my heart to see IT right at the bottom, below activities, as an input into program and service delivery. It's everywhere. So with that, Honey, over to you.
So much fun. I love that intro and lead in, because I'm about to introduce a hot take, because it's not about IT until it is. And so let me qualify that before people start throwing things at me. So I come from the government of Ontario, where I spent most of my career. Today is my 10th year anniversary at the government of Canada. And so I'm trying to make it to a year, and so much learning in the last year. I need to be able to qualify the differences moving from the province to the federal government, just so that I could better, substantiate that take. So the first thing I will mention was that as a co-founder of the Ontario Digital Service, the organization had the benefit of being in a public service that had 10 years of working enterprise IT, meaning we had an IT organization that fixed basic things like payment systems and centralized emails. I had an email address that followed me throughout my entire public service career and never changed as I moved from one department to another, for example. And so we had the privilege of being able to look at public-facing services and not just bolt on technology, but do things differently. And so there are some basic things on the platform side that could show people what is possible that is also quite broken and also needs to be addressed before we could even think about making it easier to use. The issue is that the backlog at the federal level has caught up to the point where, no, we need to address everything all at once because it's all broken. And so that's the unfortunate reality that we've found ourselves in. From Ontario, the framing around the Ontario Digital Service was also important, meaning when we were first introduced into the organization, we weren't just the shiny innovation team flavor of the month by Cabinet Office, even though we were an office set up within Cabinet Office. We had a dedicated deputy minister, and our team had a delivery team, so the group that was responsible for Ontario.ca, and then also a group that had the ability to set standards. We needed to make sure that governance was being done differently, and so the mandate was simpler, faster, better services. Faster is usually the word associated with technology, so what we measured would matter, meaning time to completion. But then internally, when the organization, the time spent navigating approvals versus the time spent delivering projects, time spent managing spreadsheets about risks rather than actually managing the actual risks, or the things we were obsessed about. The notion of how we talked about services and digital. One of the first things we wrote and talked about was digital government is 3 a.m. government, meaning the government that never sleeps, because it doesn't sleep now that the internet exists, because there's somebody there looking at their phone late at night when their kids have gone to bed from their couch, figuring out what to do because they had lost their job, or maybe they're trying to figure out how to bring their relative to Canada. And we take this for granted. And it also means when we're doing things differently, maybe we come up with a realization that, oh my goodness, that in-person center actually needs to be open in irregular hours, or there should be a call center at those hours. And so that type of framing. And then when it came to better for less, which was very much one of the imported concepts that was advertised from the UK when we modeled our organization after it. Better for less also meant that money needed to be redirected somewhere. And so I really take to heart the point about, in the parliamentary report, about the return on investment. I'm going to give stats that are likely a little bit old now. So to do an address change in person at Service Ontario probably would have been about $12 per transaction back in 2019. By phone, that would have been $9 per transaction. That's if you were in one of the government-run centers. Digitally, that was about $5 or $6, which all of a sudden makes it sound reasonable. when we were doing a scan, banks were doing it at 25 cents with a profit margin. And so if we're not doing things differently, what are we not simplifying? Sometimes the fixes that we needed to do are in processes, so it also meant shifting and actually paying attention to what is happening in our call centers. What are we not empowering them to lean out in terms of their processes? What are we not empowering people to also simplify in terms of old policies? And so unless we commit to deeper transformation and also a different way of measuring things, we're not able to do that. And so all of those things kind of make me charged up with this mission in this current role. In my current role at the Government of Canada, I'm responsible for a team that carries out the policy on service and digital. And so looking at radically simplifying that rule set, but also how we measure. So the other piece I'm responsible for is the area of management for service and digital, and really trying to radically change that as well and orient it differently. And so really looking forward to the conversation here.
Thank you so much. So there we go, AOM. There's an AOM conversation to be had. There's so much in what Honey just said. 25 cents for the bank back in the day for a change of address, and the government had only gotten it down to $5. So that's not money left on the table. That's not just that. That's money that couldn't be reallocated for a high-need service for peoples in a constituency. I'm going to stop here now. That was a pregnant pause. Well, anyways, it was a pause, okay?
Jacky?
What I wanted to do now was to beg the panel's indulgence, because we're a little bit over time. It happens. I was wondering if we could move to the Q&A portion, and I'll give y'all time to get up to the mics by asking the panel a question that they can have a quick conversation about to get you ready. Somebody's moving. Okay, there's people. Okay, you know what? I'm sorry. You're just going to have, no, to the floor.
You want to go? Want me to go first? Alrighty. I liked your 5 barriers. Those were interesting. I liked your quoting of Drucker around culture eating strategy. I think structure also eats strategy. One thing you missed, I think, was the processes of government, and you missed, and this is a shameless pitch for 3:30 this afternoon, procurement and the procurement processes. If we were to do a failure report on things like that consolidated email that we never got, one would look at the procurement function there and realize we took the lowest cost bidder who didn't have the capacity to do it. The same with the server consolidation. I would say the same with Phoenix, where people cut off certain elements of that project, the human resource support elements, in the contracting process. And probably the same with ArriveCAN. So what do you think about the idea that processes of procurement have been a major, basic stumbling block for the Government of Canada? And by the way, it's there for a reason. If, the banks can do a 25-cent address change, but if someone steals that address and uses that account, they often leave you on the hook. We've seen some famous cases from that. So it isn't exactly a parallel. I just want to make that point as well. Comments?
It's, you are 100% right. I miss procurement, and procurement is one of the big ones that is systemic and comes up on that list. So I'm really glad that you raised it. And we can kind of think about procurement as being part of that spectrum around finance and how do you fund projects. Because often, and this is on the one hand, I think approaches like Canadian Digital Service, Ontario Digital Service are trying to bring more capacity inside government. Because to be frank, I think we went through years, if not decades, of outsourcing, and we hollowed out our digital capacity inside government. So there's been a pushback to say, hey, how do we actually bring capacity in? But 100%, we're never going to have government building and running all of its own technology internally. I don't think anybody would necessarily advocate for that or make sense. And so procurement is 100% broken, right? And I say that as somebody who had been a public servant and dealt with it on that end, and now that I'm on the outside and have to work with government, I see it from the other perspective. I'll just flag, I mean, we could have a 2-hour session on procurement alone. Amanda Clark, who's a professor at Carleton University, has done a really good study last year looking at procurement, particularly at the federal government, well worth looking up. They had actually kind of scraped all of the data from federal procurement, did analysis on it, had a series of recommendations around it. And again, in the same way, you know, from my perspective, that we haven't adapted our funding models to Agile, we haven't adapted our procurement models to Agile as well, right? We procure everything as if we're buying a piece of furniture or building a bridge. And when we're talking about software and service delivery in the modern era, it 100% doesn't work that way, and our procurement models, I think, are very much holding us back from that. So appreciate you raising that, though I'd be curious what the others have to think about this as well.
I could likely do a whole hour on private sector versus public sector, and agree that government essentially has a nobody left behind model, and so that's one. There's always a duty of care. I need to talk about what happened to money saved, and the problem is there's always a danger too when we start talking about the narrative about cost reduction, because it never ends. And the truth is cost reduction can only get you so far. And if you improve a service, you create demand for it. So that money actually gets diverted, meaning the money that was saved in Ontario went to broadband. And so we need to think about what happens when you win, because that also means when we review programs, you can't just look at a discrete program in time. It needs to be thought about in relation to the others. And that's also another part of the transformation.
Of course. So procurement is probably in dire need of improvement in the government of Canada. I see that when we look at procurement processes at the Department of National Defense. If any of you has heard about the surface combatant, $80 billion. It was supposed to cost $26 billion, but plagued by delays and whatever happened is very difficult to figure out, but it went from 26 to $80 billion. How could that be? The Americans are building these ships for $1.5 billion, $2 billion a piece, and we're going to pay way over $5 billion for essentially the same ship. So how could that be? It beats me. But procurement is probably broken. That's probably the worst example. On the IT front, we like to buy off the shelf rather than develop our own. But to give you an example, in my own organization, I rely on the Library of Parliament for our internal services. We bought an off-the-shelf solution, but the library says they need to have between 9 and 12 people to customize that off-the-shelf solution. So why bother 9 to 12 people to customize? I think we could have built a new system from scratch just to have our HR and finance services. It doesn't make any sense, but I think we have a tendency in the public sector to want to tweak it our particular way. I like this report to be printed on pink paper, 8.5 by 14, while letter size paper, white would be sufficient, but we don't always realize it costs that much more to meet your specific demand, and I suspect it's probably the same with warships. I'd like to have the door open this way as opposed to that way, so not realizing it costs millions and millions more, and you multiply these specific requests by thousands, and you end up with warships that go from 26 to $80 billion.
And I'll just make an observation from the coalface of a digital transformation project that I worked on at program level. So I was program side, trying to do a very, very, very modest digital product delivery exercise. It wasn't the IT that got in the way. It was the financial resources, it was HR, it was procurement, it was governance. I had 16 different committees that I needed to report to, brief up to, loop in, communicate with. It was a horizontal initiative. Throw in 3 other departments, 3 other chains of command for a simple, modest, teeny tiny little thing that went boop when it launched on the internet. And the staff that I could never get resourced to my team results in delivery. Risk management, performance measurement, which meant that my team had to absorb that cost as well as build the thing and ship it. So just some inside perspective there. There's a real opportunity for this community to really think about its internal partners and to work with them to help them fix what's broken. So, Monsieur, you had a question?
Thanks. I'm going to build off the last question. My name's Rory McDonald. I'm a consultant with BDO Canada in a practice who focus on strategy and transformation. It was a really interesting session, and some of the pieces that really stood out was a comment, Ryan, with regards to the management structure, and kind of made me think of, and one that pairs well is the play to win strategy of what is our winning aspiration, where do we play, how do we win, what are the capabilities, and the last foundation is management structure. And for example, we heard an extreme with procurement in terms of the elements that foster support and measure that success of what winning looks like. So as a panel who's lived this, what are some of the elements that we could pursue and champion with respect to management structures that support digital transformation and the role of policy, Honey, on what that would look like? Because even the example of warships, someone's described the government of Canada as a battleship, and even if you sprint down, you're only moving as fast as that ship. And I think that building off that analogy too, it's interesting to see again the confines and the complexity of doing this. So again, your thoughts on what specific management structures we need to collectively, and how do we do that at the whole of government, or maybe at a departmental level for those of us there that can make more immediate change?
We need smaller battleships. But I'm going to turn to Honey first on this one, because I know she's got some thoughts. Well, everybody does, but I know over there.
On governance, definitely leaner is better. I think that's probably the first principle. If we think about the different committees and the different groups that we report to, and actually the membership and the terms of reference for each of those committees, it's very easy to actually even just scan sort of how much value will they add to the conversation, what are they going to actually unblock for you, and in some cases, do they need to be at that meeting? Because most of the time we include people because it's easier to just make sure that by ceremony they're in that committee rather than not. And so really examine what are we trying to get done versus not. Different way of managing that too in terms of expectations where so on the public service side, there is a habit of giving away your agency. I need permission for everything at every level. In some cases, at certain leadership levels, you kind of have to take charge and say, okay, this part, because I'm closest to the decision that needs to be made, is the call I'm going to make, and I can stand by it and give you the evidence and provide the audit trail. And then moving upward from there. More philosophically, organizationally, I think the habit is policy first, meaning make it required when nobody else has done it, or when nobody else understands what requiring something actually means, and the other levers are also available or at that disposal. So it's one thing to make it required, you also need to make it worthwhile. So Ryan mentioned incentives in the organization, make it easier to do. Make the experience of actually following that requirement easier rather than the current default. Make it possible, have the actual surrounding environment, change the operating environment so that it's actually harder to do it that way. And then, of course, make it mainstream. So don't just have the innovation team doing things and breathe different air or have different realities from the rest of government.
Others?
Yeah, I'll jump in. When Honey said leaner, that was music to my ear. So lean, lean, lean. Shorter meetings, fewer people involved. If you don't have a value added to a meeting, you don't have to be there, and you don't want to invite them. So lean structures, and besides that, I think I've always been a big proponent of you can have the worst governance structure that exists if you have people of goodwill who want to make a progress, who are like willing to attack a problem and solve it, it'll work. You can have the best governance structures. If you have dead wood, it won't go that far. But having the ideal situation is good governance, good structures, and people who want to make progress. But leaner is much, much preferable. I went from CRA, 40,000 employees, to my current role, 38 employees, and that makes a whole difference in the speed at which things can move.
And I'll just add a couple very quick thoughts on this. I think, on that question around governance and management structure, we do have fractured governance at the federal level around digital. That's just a reality. And if you compare us to other jurisdictions, we've kind of split the responsibility across a half dozen plus different agencies. I think that's a challenge, right? The way that we're set up around that. We also have the unique challenge, or somewhat unique challenge, of federal provincial responsibility. And so when it comes to things like digital identity, this has been, I think, in Canada, one of the stumbling blocks compared to more unitary types of systems of government. So this is something I think there are going to have to be some unique kind of governance arrangements set up in Canada to address that. Part of that is making sure that there are people at the senior management table who are advocating for this, and we've seen the evolution of CIO roles move into chief digital officers. We're seeing the creation of chief data officer roles. I think that's really important. Even if we go to our most senior management table and look at cabinet, I was encouraged in the recent cabinet shuffle that they brought in a Minister of Citizen Services. We had a Minister of Digital Government for a while. It went away for a bit. I actually think we're at a point in digital maturity where it is useful to have somebody around the cabinet table whose full-time job is to think about the citizen experience and what that means in the modern world. And I think that notion then kind of trickles down in organizations to ensuring that we've got people at the management table who are empowered to be able to spur their colleagues on this. So a couple quick thoughts on that.
I'll just make a quick comment too. Concretely, when you go back to your home departments, you've got that policy on results on your desktop. You click it every day, you look at it and you go, ooh. Now do that for the, or you scream silently, internally, I get it. But also, go and read the policy on service and digital, read them together, and then go and get the policy on management and planning of investments, and then grab, just because you wanna, the policy on communications, because you know what? That tells you right there that we do not have a coherent view of what it is that we're trying to do to bring about digital government. But at least once you see that fractured framework, you can begin to identify who your colleagues and partners for bringing about that change are going to be. You can start having some critical conversations to lean it all out. Now, I'm sorry, but we have time just for one more question, and then we'll make closing comments. Over to you.
Yeah, I think I'd encourage the panelists to think some of the governance processes in place, a lot of the departments don't have a choice over. And I've seen it in the last decade where this has started to come up, especially on the digital side. So my question to you is, in your collective opinions, do you think Shared Services Canada has helped or hindered in the move towards a digital government? As you can tell, I have my very own opinion, but I'd be interested in yours.
Quick check, who here is from SSC? All right, we can proceed with responses.
I'm not qualified to opine on, I'm just too new.
Yeah, I think the perspective from the end users can often be that SSC is a pain, but I think it's very, very easy to forget that SSC is doing something that we don't think about, and it's doing it very well. It's protecting the government of Canada and that huge, huge organization, the public sector, federal public sector, it's protecting it from cyber threats, and I think it's doing it very well, considering that we have, or the government has work sites across the country and abroad, and it's protecting that pipeline very well. But is it as good as it could or should be? Probably not. When you try to have a phone or a tablet or a computer, it can take a while, but it does security, I think, very, very well. And that's probably the extent of my comments, knowing not that much on the IT front.
Nice, spicy question to end things off. I mean, you know, let me give, I mean, my very short answer, and I'll just give a little bit more context around it, is no. It's not clear to me that SSC, as it's constituted right now, is really obviously being able to kind of knock it out of the park in a variety of different ways. It's got a very tough job in front of it, right? And, you know, I think there was, when it was initially created, there was a lot of push around cost savings behind it, and I think, to be frank, the cost savings haven't materialized. Yves probably knows this better than I do, but I think, you know, the projections of what it would look like on that haven't gotten there. I do think, you know, there are places where it absolutely makes sense to have that centralized expertise, and the cybersecurity is a great example around that. But I think there is this perennial debate in the digital transformation space around how much do you go to enterprise approaches and a one-size-fits-all for everything versus how much do you allow space for innovation at a much more local level. And I tend to be one who leans towards the kind of diversity of innovation approach to this, because I think the federal government is so big and so complex with such different needs that other than a couple of core areas, it is actually very tough to have a one-size-fits-all approach that really works everywhere. So my kind of encouragement on this is, I think as SSC's evolving and digital's evolving, I think we got to think about, you know, what are maybe those handful of things where it is useful to have kind of a single organization doing it, but then keep as much space as we can for experimentation and innovation at a department or even a team level. Somebody had mentioned the battleship analogy before, and I think 100% government is a big battleship, but to extend that analogy, you've got the helicopters and the jets and the speedboats attached to the battleship, which can go at different speeds. And so I think it's worth thinking about the big ship of state's going to take time to move, but that doesn't mean that there aren't parts of it that can't move faster. And so being able to essentially think in two speeds at the same time, I think, is an important part of this. And I don't think we've gotten that balance right yet.
Yeah. And don't forget the canoes and kayaks.
Yes.
3 quick takeaways, okay? And it's a wrap-up comment. There's a new competency required of all public servants now, whichever level of government you work for, and that is to develop digital competencies. It's a journey. Add it to your learning plan. There's a lot of fellow travelers that you need to meet. So find the people in your organization that are already working on digital transformation, get to know them, figure out how to become a really good partner, co-developer, and ally to give them some bandwidth that they desperately need. And you know, it's a plea, and it's a plea that you can go to the mirror and repeat to yourself every day. What kind of government interaction do you want to have when you come across a service touch point, okay? You may be corporate, you may be far away from a frontline service delivery, but please never ever forget that there are people at the end of the products and services that are built for peoples in Canada. So help bring about digital government for them. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bart.
I'd like to thank the panel for a very interesting session, and please. We are going to transition to the next panel, so don't wander too far. It's going to be here, and we'll go off and the new group will come on. Thank you again, everybody.